If he thinks that Iraq was a disaster, you should wait what Iran will be. If they have twice the population of Iraq, their territory is almost 4 times as large. It's very mountainous, which is why they have not just nuclear facilities, but also thousands of missiles deep underground. So they can't be hit, which means that they're going to be very durable in a war of attrition. They control the Strait of Hormuz, where most of this oil comes through. So they can shut down the world, the global economy, something they might do as well, and crash the US economy. So there's a lot of things that Iran can do, which is worth thinking about if you're planning to attack this country. I mean, we've done a lot of stupid wars, that is the Western countries, over the past 30 years, but this is really something very, very different. This is beyond crazy.
Well, everyone, I'm very excited to welcome back into the studio Professor Glenn Diesen from the University of Southeastern Norway. Professor Diesen, you are one of the best experts in all of Europe on the Russia-Ukraine war. We've enjoyed your insights. But of course, there's a new global conflict that has really come up out of almost nowhere in the last week. And I'm very excited to have you back into the studio, as we certainly want to talk about this new conflict between Israel and Iran. We're going to relate it back to also Russia and Ukraine and kind of so many different conflicts going on. So first of all, welcome back to the show.
Oh, thank you. No, it's great to be back on your program.
I'd like you to give us a little bit of an overview of what you think of this situation from your perspective, being a prominent professor in Europe and an expert on this geopolitics.
Israel's been talking about striking Iran now for decades, and often warning about its nuclear weapons program, or what it claims to be a nuclear weapons program. Now, this is, I think, I see this more as an excuse to attack, a bit like George Bush's WMDs in Iraq. So I was myself in Iran a few weeks ago, and I visited some of these nuclear facilities and got to speak with diplomats and military leaders and all. And well, my impression was that if the United States wanted a deal with Iran, they could have one, because US says they can't have a nuclear weapon. Iran says they don't want a nuclear weapon. So as long as they're on the same page, then you can have a deal with somewhat intrusive inspections. Indeed, the Iranians agreed to the JCPOA, but it was Trump under his first administration that pulled out of this. Now, I think still, even though there's some distrust, a new deal could have been made. But the problem is that the United States, it linked a nuclear deal to everything else. That is, first of all, it wasn't, there might have been a deal in which some of the enrichment was perhaps done by, of uranium was done by Russia, and they supplied it. Some deal could be made, but the Trump administration said they're not even allowed to have a civilian nuclear program, which is a breach of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. That's the same treaty who says Iran can't have nuclear weapons, states it's allowed to have a civilian nuclear program. In addition, the United States linked this also to limitations on Iran's military, its ballistic missiles capabilities, also its partnerships with other actors in the region, be it Hamas, Hezbollah, Yemen. So it kind of linked the nuclear issue to everything, making it almost demand for a capitulation. So under these conditions, a deal could not be made. So this is why I'm a bit skeptical of the whole argument that this was simply a demand for preventing Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. Indeed, if they do want a nuclear weapon now, is pretty much this attack will convince them maybe to do so. So it's I think it's a massive blunder. And but again, I don't think the war was supposed to go as it's going at the moment.
It's amazing to hear that you're actually on the ground in Iran. Tell us a little bit more about that. I mean, tell us, if you can tell us more about your travels there. And you mentioned that you actually met with Iranian officials and had kind of a sneak peek into that. Tell us more. I'm very fascinated to learn more about this.
Well, I was there for it was initially a media conference, but it was but at the same time there was also a possibility to visit some of their military installations, again, nuclear facilities. I even rented the studio they had at the TV studio, hooked to do an episode of my podcast there from the studio. But that studio was bombed yesterday, so that's gone. And well, it was a lot of different international experts was there as well, and it's shared a panel with interesting people. George Galloway was there, Alistair Crook was there, and a variety of experts. So no, it was quite interesting, and I have to admit I didn't expect. Well, I knew that Israel wanted to strike Iran, and they, as the Israeli leadership had been saying for a while, they see this as an historic opportunity because they've been killing Hamas as well as much of the population in Gaza. They also weakened Hezbollah in Lebanon. They knocked out, assisted in knocking out Syria and now conquered some of that territory, and also been bombing Yemen. So they saw that a lot of the allies of Iran were weakened. So in the Israeli leadership, they spoke about a historical opportunity to now go after Iran. And still, I think the Iranians knew that an attack might come, but I think they were also taken by surprise, given that it happened in the middle of the negotiations. Keep in mind, President Trump was reassuring that we were close to a deal can be made here, more or less used this fake negotiation to lower the guard of the Iranians in preparation of an Israeli attack. And I think that the objective, though, was to have a very powerful decapitation strike. That is, they went heavily after the military leadership, political leadership. They had a cyber attack that locked down the Iranian air defenses for many hours. They also killed quite a few journalists. So they went after keynotes in Iran. And I think the hope was that it would be so powerful that there would be some kind of a collapse of government, perhaps some regime change. This is usually the goal in this war as well. But instead, we saw that the Iranians were able to regroup somewhat, not too fast. They suffered severely on the first day, with many key people being killed. And I think the air defenses were down more or less for 8 hours. So, but then they regrouped. They were able to restore control, and they began to retaliate. So now what was intended to be a quick decapitation attack has now turned out to become more of a war of attrition. And this is not great for Israel because it's running out of interceptive missiles. Its air defenses are getting weaker. And I think the Iranians have more options in terms of replenishing their missiles as opposed to Israel, which is struggling a bit more, especially after the Ukraine war, when the West has already exhausted a lot of its weapons. So it puts the Israelis in a very difficult situation for them, because the way they see it, they can't go for peace now, because Iran will then be stronger than it was before the attack. Israel's entire deterrent will have been weakened. So what Israel do if they don't want to have a ceasefire and a peace? Well, either the United States come in to help them to destroy Iran, or they have to bring out a nuclear weapon or something more dramatic. But I'm not sure what other options there are, which is why this is a very scary situation. So I'm assuming that the United States is going to join in on the fight within the next few days.
Well, I definitely, it's very interesting. I go back, 20 something years ago to, 2003. And I remember, when the United States obviously entered that war against Iraq. And I think it's a very different time as well, because, leading up to that invasion, I think the United States government had a lot of time to really sell that war to the American people. We had, for example, it's well documented now that, leading up to that the United States government had launched many campaigns to really make sure that the American public thought that Saddam Hussein was actually behind even 9/11. That was actually a big thing that they did, is they said, we actually, public opinion in America were so misguided by this propaganda from the US government that the majority of Americans actually thought Saddam was behind 9/11 and that this was responsible, hence the justification for this war. So you had a very different situation there. You had a lot of time to sell this to the American people. Most Americans were really on board with that. I did see a tweet that you sent out. It was very interesting, from a YouGov poll, where it says, most Americans think the US military should not get involved in this conflict. So I think it's really caught the world at a very interesting point right now, because even inside the United States, my home country, I know the majority of Americans do not want to see the United States involved in another forever war. I think, could we win a war against Iran? I think that the United States could certainly hurt Iran, but I don't think that it could immediately be a win. I mean, I look back at our history, we haven't had a very good track record of winning wars. I think the last big war that we've won, of course, was World War II. We've had many military defeats and quite frankly, just blunders. Our track record in the Middle East is very, very poor. But I know that Donald Trump has also isolated himself and his MAGA crowd. The MAGA crowd, they certainly elected Donald Trump on this idea of being a peace president and being able to garner that in. Let me know your thoughts on Donald Trump specifically. Do you feel that, has he been planning this with Israel? I mean, has this always been something that he wanted to do and that he's just now shifted? I mean, what is your thoughts on Trump and this incredible pivot that we've seen from him?
I'm not sure how long he planned to choose war instead, to be honest. There are some divisions within his government between the America First and I guess the neocons forever wars. But to what extent he jumped over to the neocons, or he always wanted this, it's unclear to me. It is interesting, though, that he says, well, America First was my concept. I decide the content, which is a very common theme, by the way, that you get people on board with a concept that's very popular. You say, America First, help Ukraine, whatever it is. All politicians do this, something that everyone can agree on. And then
Right.
you fill it with the content which you want thereafter. And he claims more or less he has the right to fill it with what he wants. So preventing Iran from getting nuclear weapon is America First now. So it's yes, but it's also possible that he bought into the idea that this would be a quick fix, because it's worth noting that the United States didn't have all its capabilities there. That's what it's in process of doing now, shifting a lot of its military capabilities to the region. I think what they believed was the Israelis would take care of this themselves in this very hard-hitting decapitation attack, and then the United States could sit back and claim victory. I think as it's not working this way, I think now they have to step in. I also think that he might have just got himself in a very unfortunate position, given that this is what he thought Israelis could take care of them themselves, because now he's in a very strange position. If he doesn't support Israel, then he's going to have to take responsibility for the defeat of Israel. And if he does get into this, it's essentially a war, which there's no good outcome here. What is he going to do? What is the exit strategy? Surely this has been the lesson of the past 30 years. What is the exit strategy? Is Iran going to completely capitulate? You're going to have some imaginary regime change, like for a popular uprising, where you can't really introduce the kind of the ground troops which one would require to do essentially what they set out to do. So it's just going to be a very messy bombing and killing. And but again, Iran is a very different animal, though. It's not Iraq. It's huge, and it's a huge population, huge territory. It's well armed. It has powerful friends, and also, as you suggested, the weakness on the American part is that they didn't prepare the population for this. Usually, you build up consent over months and months, and as you said before the invasion of Iraq, they very strategically referred to Al Qaeda and then Saddam Hussein in the same sentence over and over again. To the point when, I think on the eve of the invasion of Iraq, majority of Americans thought that Iraq had something to do with it, which would be an absurd proposition if one would say it out loud, because they did not care for each other at all. And
Right.
Instead, you have this argument now that, well, you have Tulsi Gabbard making the statement that Iran is not pursuing a nuclear weapon. You have Trump himself saying that a deal can be made, and suddenly bombing Iran's nuclear reactors. I mean, it's there's no convincing narrative here. All we have to lean into is, as the Europeans are doing as well, by the way, so Israel has a right to defend themselves. From what? This was an Israeli unprovoked and surprise attack. So and then so there's no good narratives to lean into. Instead, one good propaganda piece, which is usually done, is you divide the issue based on which side you support. Are you with Israel or Iran? So if you criticize it, then you're standing with Iran. But that's not the division. The division is between those who think it's a workable peace available and those who's choosing war. But we do the same with the Ukraine war, by the way. If you say, well, this is, there's a workable peace here if you don't expand NATO, for example, and then they choose to present the dividing lines differently. That is, oh, well, if you're not supporting this, that means you're supporting Russia instead of Ukraine. So if you can control the way you think the dividing lines are, then you can win over a lot of people. But they haven't prepared the public for this war. It came a little bit out of nowhere for many people. So so I think this is a disaster for many reasons.
Yeah, I think so, and I like that you brought up Tulsi Gabbard earlier in the interview here. For those of you that aren't familiar, she had given a big report. I believe it was in March, so just a couple months ago, where she had basically given this whole report saying that we now have conclusive evidence that Iran is not building a nuclear. They don't have that ambitions. I think this is very well documented. Then the other bit of evidence that is very telling, there was a big clip from CNN who had showed Netanyahu over the years, I think as early as 1995 or 1996, saying that Iran is only weeks away from developing a nuclear weapons. And then, again, that was updated in 2001, 2002, 2006. And you see over the last 25 years, this has been the message from Netanyahu and from Israel that Iran is somehow only weeks away. I cover China a lot on this YouTube channel, and we hear this thing of, China is going to collapse. And, this has been, propagandized from Gordon Chang, who wrote a book, The Coming Collapse of China in 2001, and then updated that every, 2 to 3 years, saying that the collapse is coming. It's imminent, but we've only seen China, collapse into the second largest economy in the world. And obviously anybody that has a brain and can just look at simple facts, we know that China is not going to collapse anytime soon. It's too big of a economy. And I think it's very, we see a lot of these parallels between, like you mentioned, Russia, Ukraine, whether we're talking China, certainly with Israel and Iran. I think it's very, very telling. And I think that's why it's important to have these podcasts and to have professors like yourself that can help the common people see through the propaganda. And I just want to point that out. I love how you've mentioned it's not about, Russia, Ukraine, pick a side, or Israel, Iran, pick a side. It goes much more beyond that. Is there a way to find peace, or do you want to have war? That's the two solutions. And certainly, I think you've made your point very clear with Ukraine. We know this has been well documented, right? NATO expansion is behind that war. That is the key central issue here. It's not Putin wanting to recreate the Soviet Union. I don't think Putin has any ambitions to march into Western Europe and take over all of Europe. This is preposterous. But yet, that is what we continue to hear. Even here we are, even 3 years after the recent escalation, we continue to hear this as a very popular line amongst our American politicians. Professor, I want to talk a little bit about Israel. Do you think that they were completely surprised in Iran's retaliation? Did you think, obviously you mentioned earlier, this was an unprovoked attack from Israel. Obviously, Israel began this war by first bombing Iran. Do you believe that they've been surprised by Iran's response?
Well, possibly, because I think they overestimated or underestimated how weak Iran was. That is the idea that everyone hates their government. They're awfully oppressed, and as soon as the government would be seen to be weak, people would just rise up in the street and try to topple it. So I think at some level they do believe their own propaganda that. By bombing the Iranian government, they're actually on the side of the Iranian people. If you tell yourself these stories all the time, at the end, you believe them. I'm sure many people in Washington believe that the American troops would be greeted as liberators when they came to Iraq. And I think it's kind of the same idea that, when we started the sanctions on Russia in 2022 as well, the thought was, we put sanctions and then once we stripped Putin of his economic power, then surely people would rise up against him, even though he's the most popular president that there is in Europe. So we often create these narratives, and we end up fooling ourselves. So the ones with Iran is that the government is deeply unpopular. People would want to topple it, and the second would be that we underestimate its military capabilities as well. So, and I'm glad you mentioned the same with China, because we do tell the same stories every time. That is by the way, with Russia, they do the same since the 90s. There's this article in Atlantic from 2001 as well, where predicted imminent collapse of Russia. And every year kind of republish this same story. But it's always the same, whether it's all opponents, be it China, Russia, Iran, they're all weak governments, they're unpopular. And if we try to knock them out, the people there would actually stand on our side. And also, they're all a bit paper tigers. They don't really have much strength. They're all a bit backward. And so China, it can't innovate. It just copies. Russia's a gas station masquerading as a country. And Iran is just a bunch of fanatic religious nuts who imported some missiles here and there. So it's a nice narrative and builds up the good versus evil and superior versus inferior. But the danger always with these narratives is we end up deluding ourselves. So I think there's probably a lot to this, because the political elites, they tend to end up living in their own bubbles, and the media kind of parrots them as well.
This is the biggest problem that we see right now. And I think interesting, going back to that YouGov poll, ironically, it seems to be, this is the one thing that does unite, the parties here in America. But we have, adult U.S. citizens, 60% not wanting this war, Democrats, 65%, Independents, 61%, Republicans, 53%. So, you do have majority of Americans who are opposing this. It kind of goes back to what we said earlier, the fact that the United States hasn't had enough time to sell this war and really propagandize these U.S. citizens.
The reason why the U.S. didn't prepare the population properly for this war as well is that Trump just won the election and took over the presidency as a peace candidate. Keep in mind that he had been scolding the invasion of Iraq. He's been saying, these forever wars in the Middle East are a disaster. I'm going to make sure we never do this. Indeed, he accused both Obama and Biden of possibly doing this huge foolish mistake of invading Iran, something he would never, do. So he won the election based on this. So for him to suddenly flip like this and expect his whole base to follow him, I think he overestimated his own grandeur, how much power he actually has. So it's
Right.
and as soon as people question him, his main backer in the media has been Tucker Carlson. And as soon as Tucker Carlson says this is not a good idea, he goes and more or less tries to embarrass him in front of camera, saying, well, you don't even have a network anymore. Why would you? His main people, of course, he went after Elon Musk when he stopped showing full loyalty. And
Right.
he was on the plane, and someone referenced Tulsi Gabbard. I mean, this is his own intelligence chief saying that there's no nuclear weapon coming, and well, I don't agree with her. So
Right.
it is very strange. But anyways, on the G7, they met. Of course, they're going to discuss. They discussed the two main wars now, which is the Ukraine war and the war against Iran, and they come with the common obligatory statements that suggest that they're for peace and they want de-escalation. So they say we want de-escalation, but they don't actually say what it means. If you want a de-escalation in Iran, you would argue for a ceasefire. I would assume that that would be a first step, but there's no such thing. So they didn't ask for a ceasefire. So what exactly does de-escalation mean in this context? Well, no one really says. So it's a lot of empty words, which sounds nice.
Right.
The journalist will make sure to uncritically make the headlines, but there's nothing there. And and with Ukraine, it's also the Europeans aren't that interested in anything that moves towards a peace. They would like to see this continue as well. Something that's beginning to annoy the Ukrainians, by the way. There's a lot more dissent growing in Ukraine now, where they recognizing that the Europeans won't let them finish this war. So no, there's not much to agree on. Indeed, when Trump said he would leave, he had to leave early because of the war against Iran. Macron said, "Oh yeah, he has to leave because he's going to work on a ceasefire." And even the idea that he would work on a ceasefire was so offensive that he slammed Macron as well. He called him I guess, publicity hungry, something along those lines, which is funny coming from Trump. And
Right.
yeah, but so even among themselves, they're squabbling. So there wasn't much that came out of this. And of course, there's very little weapons to go to Ukraine these days. If anything, the United States have to get some of its air defenses back from Ukraine and shuffle them to Israel. And this is kind of the main problem now in Ukraine. That is, they're short on men, so they have to shuffle people between the different front lines in Ukraine in order to prevent it from collapsing. And now, of course, the United States is also needing to shuffle its air defenses around because there's not enough to go around. And but meanwhile, if you open the newspapers here, it doesn't come up as an issue. I mean, the shortage of men here, because I actually saw there was an article here a few days ago in this country where argued, yes, we need to have more openness about how we discuss the Ukraine war. However, some things are beyond what you're allowed to discuss. For example, the idea that Ukraine is losing the war. This is a dangerous Kremlin propaganda narrative, so we will stop supporting Ukraine. So, I mean, the most obvious thing that Ukraine is losing, you're not allowed to say. And but also the idea that Ukraine doesn't have a manpower shortage. This is probably their biggest problem now. And now, of course, they're being stripped of their weapons as well. So the war on Iraq is not great for. War on Iran is not great for Zelensky. But something positive could come from this, because the Ukraine war has been lost, and in the West we don't really know what to do when we lose a war. The best thing is to move on to the next thing, to simply shift the focus. So this could be an opportunity to end the Ukraine war as the focus is somewhere else.
If we could get a ceasefire there and some type of compromise that we not risking Ukrainian lives would be fantastic, I think, for Ukraine and to come to some sort of settlement there. And I'm still interested in this move from Trump. And do you feel that that the main reason for this is really the Israeli lobby? I mean, is that really the pressure that's coming in? I mean, does the Israeli lobby, do they just hold so much power in the U.S. government and specifically over Donald Trump that he could make this decision?
Historically, Israel was seen as, especially after 1967, Israel was seen as a very powerful bridgehead. That is a country in which the U.S. could project power across the region. However, over the past decades now, it looks as if Israel's becoming more of a liability. That is, it's making the relationship with the different Arab states, Iran and others, much, much more difficult. So, the Israeli lobby is quite powerful in the United States. And I guess if it was only naturally in the interest of the United States to back Israel in all its wars, you would need this powerful lobby. Why do they finance and fund candidates on both sides of the aisle to such a huge extent? Why would this be necessary if there was a natural alignment of interests or values or whatever it should be? So I think the lobby has a lot to do with it. But it's also a very powerful narrative, which is also very attractive in Europe. That is, given the discrimination and the suffering of the Jews over the decades. I mean, I think I belong into that camp as well. I think there's a lot of natural sympathy that is Israel, after its history, or the Jewish people at least, after its history of suffering, the idea that it has its own state and now should be in a position to defend itself. It's a very attractive proposition, but the problem is you end up in a situation now where Palestinians in Gaza are being subjected to a genocide, and they effectively have to die now for the crimes of the Germans. It doesn't sit well. So I think the new generation coming up now, they come with different ideas.
Right.
So I think there's a combination of things. So again, the ability to project power, a bit of the appealing history of this, that is to support Israel, and also, of course, a very powerful lobby.
It's been well documented, the Israeli lobby, how much power that they do hold, over the U.S. Congress. Certainly, I think Donald Trump as well, certainly funded by the Israeli lobby. And I mean, yeah, it's always an interesting one, because obviously we all know the history of the Jewish people. I mean, we know the history of what happened in World War II. I definitely believe that Israel has a right to exist. I certainly wouldn't be against that. But it is quite amazing when you look at the facts of, for example, in the Middle East, Israel is the only one with nuclear warheads, at their disposal. They also are the biggest cause for a lot of these wars. And I think what's interesting is that you mentioned the shift that's happening with this new generation. I do see a lot younger people, especially in the United States, are much more sympathetic to certainly the Palestinian cause and to what's happening in Gaza. I mean, it's been well documented that this is, in fact, a genocide that's going on against the people of Palestine, and specifically Gaza. I mean, it's an absolute tragedy that certainly Western governments have been allowing to support. And it's, again, the same thing you mentioned earlier, right? You have to pick a side, and unfortunately, it's either do you side with Israel or do you side with Hamas? And I don't think anybody really sides with Hamas. It's more just looking at humanity.
It's all about, as you said, selling the war. So in all propaganda, you want to be able to label the us group versus out group, the them. And so just notice every time there's Israel engages in conflict with anyone, we don't talk about Israel, we talk about Jews, because everyone has a natural sympathy there, at least in Europe and North America. But this is also a bit false, because if you look inside in North America, a lot of the different peace groups are Jewish. They're saying, they're sensitive. They keep saying, not in my name. So this is not about, if you don't support this, then the assumption is then you're against Jews. So then nobody wants to be anti-Semitic. So, and if you're accused of this, it can be, kill your career as well. So people tend to fall in line on this. And as you said, if you criticize this, not only are against Jews, they say, but then you're also for Hamas or terrorists or anything you want. So it's all about the framing, which is why we end up in this absurd situation. I mean, the German chancellor now, he went out and said, "Oh, Israel's doing the dirty work for all of us." I mean, what are we doing here? This was this possibility to reach an agreement on the nuclear issue. I'm convinced that the Iranians, if we also take into account their security concerns, they could be convinced to, for example, allow the Russians to do their enrichment, something along those lines. And instead, we went along with now backing a genocide, and a lot of the European leaders are backing the genocide, especially the Germans in Gaza, and now hitting nuclear reactors in what is effectively the nuclear terrorism on Iran's soil. And what is the outcome? Most likely, Iran will reach the conclusion it needs a nuclear deterrent. It gets a nuclear weapon, then Saudi Arabia will do this. If you were afraid of a nuclear weapon in Iran before, now is a genuine reason to be concerned. So it's everything about this is stupid. It's not good for anyone. And but they're trying to force you into a position where there's only one position which is legitimate.
I want to talk a little bit about Iran, because, like you said, this is a very different country. This is not in Iraq. I mean, very interesting. Tucker Carlson had interviewed Senator Ted Cruz earlier, and he had asked him, I think some very important questions. For example, what is the population of Iran? The senator couldn't even tell him. And it was funny because Ted Cruz was trying to deflect that as, oh, we're not going to play games here. I don't sit here and memorize population tables, Tucker. And he said, sure. Well, then can you tell me the ethnic breakdown of, the people that are in Iran? And he kind of smiled and smirked, and he's like, look, we're not going to play these games, during this interview. But I just want you to know, Tucker, that we are bombing Iran. And then Tucker says, wow, this is a revelation. So are you now admitting that the U.S. government is, in fact, bombing Iran? He said, well, Israel's doing it, but we're helping them do that. I mean, all signs are really leading to the United States now fully entering this war. I think, we've talked to a lot of prominent people, and a lot of, I think, experts are now almost convinced that this is going to come at any time, that the U.S. is going in. But I think we're looking at a very different situation. Iran is a much bigger country. We look at even the fact of the oil reserves, how big they are. I mean, they have a large portion of the oil in the world is coming from Iran, a lot of natural gas supplies. I think this war is going to be a very different animal than I think what many Americans, and certainly Israel, think.
No, I think definitely. And I don't know why these are tricky questions or games. I mean, this seems very relevant. If you think that Iraq was a disaster, you should wait what Iran will be. First of all, the population does matter, because they have twice the population of Iraq. Their territory is almost 4 times as large. It's very mountainous, which is why they have not just nuclear facilities, but also thousands of missiles deep underground. So they can't be hit, which means that they're going to be very durable in a war of attrition. They have close connections with the Russians in the north, just across the Caspian, which means that it can be supplied. They have a very close corridor with China towards the east, not a shared border, but they can go through the China-Pakistan corridor. They control the Strait of Hormuz, where most of this oil comes through. So they can shut down the world, the global economy, something they might do as well, and crash the U.S. economy. So there's a lot of things that Iran can do, which is worth thinking about if you're planning to attack this country. I mean, we've done a lot of stupid wars, that is the Western countries, over the past 30 years, but this is really something very, very different. This is beyond crazy, and I don't even see a path to success. No one defines success. You can deter a country from doing many things. You can deter a country from using nuclear weapons, but bombing a country into submission, that's not how it works. The unfortunate lessons over the years has been, if you're a country like Iraq or Libya who gives up their nuclear weapons program, you will be destroyed and humiliated. If you're Pakistan or North Korea, you develop your nuclear weapons, now you're safe. No one will touch you. Bombing Iran into submission, it's going to do the opposite. This is a horrible, horrible idea. But this is also the problem with a surprise attack when you haven't even prepared the public for it. Surely Ted Cruz should know some of the basics if he wants to start this war, because this is a war that can escalate in many, many ways. And you see this now with Israeli cities being bombed. This is not the problem that Israel had in the past to such an extent. So it does. We do need people like Tucker Carlson, because this is questions the media should have asked, but unfortunately the media doesn't really do it.
Well, I think that is certainly the reason why the rise of YouTube has become so popular, and I think it's why even yourself as well. I mean, you've had a great YouTube channel that's been really growing very fast as of late. We've had a lot of great guests on, and so I'm a big fan of your channel, and I just thank you so much for sharing these incredible insights. I mean, I've learned a lot today, and I'm so fascinated to hear that just a few weeks ago you were in Iran and had a chance to actually personally visit these facilities, gain an insight that many foreigners don't get to gain. And I think, you really bring a nice, rational point of view. And, we're certainly going to have you on the program again to talk, maybe more about this conflict, certainly the Russia-Ukraine. I'll just leave you with any final thoughts that you have here, Glenn, but thank you again so much for your time and educating us all on this situation.
No, thank you. And no, very happy to come on your program anytime. I'm a big fan of your work. So, and if anyone wants to follow my channel, it's just my name, Glenn Diesen. So, no, it's dangerous times. I mean, I just want to remind people that this attack on Iran, it followed barely 2 weeks after the attack on Russia's nuclear deterrent, which also most likely could not have happened without any cooperation with Western intelligence. It also entailed drones which had been smuggled into the country to attack Russia, much like the drones have been smuggled into Iran to attack there as well. So there's a lot of similarities, and the fact that we're now engaged in attacking the nuclear deterrent of Russia, the largest state, the nuclear power in the world, and attacking Iranian nuclear reactors, we're going down a very dark path here. And this, I wish there was some good news, but it's all looking like we're going to go into some very dangerous months ahead.
Yeah, I think so. Well, I was trying to end our show today on a more positive note, but I have to agree with you. I don't think there's really anything positive at the moment. It does look like we're going down this dark road. It does look like Trump has really turned. He's gone from this peaceful president to very much looking like that we are going to have U.S. troops on the ground, or certainly get involved with a direct strike in Iran. And like I mentioned earlier, I just think, knowing the United States track record with wars, and certainly our reputation in the Middle East, it doesn't look like this is going to be a good one. And I think the U.S. and Israel, quite frankly, are going to be in for a long road ahead, because this is a different country, right? Like you mentioned, it's different than Iraq, it's different than Libya. And because of how important Iran is to the global economy, I think that, we really need some wisdom here in the White House, and I'm not sure if we're going to get it. So we might get the opposite of that, which is going to be some chaotic times ahead. But as always, we're going to be reporting here on the YouTube channel. Everybody, make sure that you also follow along with Glenn's channel. He does a fantastic job, some amazing interviews. We're going to drop all those links down in the show notes below. And I want to thank you all for your amazing support, and we look forward to seeing you all in our next interview soon.